The name hit her like a bullet she never heard coming. Della Walker stood frozen in the doorway of Sheriff Hank Pruitt's office in Abilene, Kansas, her knuckles white around the folded wanted poster someone had slipped under her boarding house door that morning. The paper shook in her hands, not from the October wind that howled down the main street of town, but because the face sketched in crude black ink above the words "wanted dead or alive" looked exactly like the man who had knelt in the dust beside her broken wagon 3 days ago, his hands gentle as a preacher's as he worked to save her from being stranded 30 miles from civilization. Martin Cooper. Reward: $500. Crimes: robbery, evasion of federal authority, suspected conspiracy against the Kansas Pacific Railroad. $500. That was more money than Della had seen in 3 years of teaching school in the territories. That was enough money to pay off every debt her dead father had left behind, enough to buy the small piece of bottomland near Ellsworth she had been dreaming about since she was 17 years old, standing in a Kansas cornfield looking west and wondering if the world got better somewhere past the horizon. And the man who could earn her that $500 had looked at her with the most honest brown eyes she had ever seen, had fixed her shattered axle with nothing but a hand wrench and a length of iron rod he carried in his own saddlebag, had refused payment, had touched the brim of his hat with 2 quiet fingers, and had ridden away into the tall grass before she could even form the words to thank him properly. She had thought about those eyes every single night since. Now she stood in the sheriff's doorway with the wind cutting through her coat like a skinning knife, and she understood with sudden terrible clarity that the man who had been kind to her when he had absolutely no reason to be kind was hunted. He was running from something large and dangerous. And she, Della Walker, 24 years old, schoolteacher, broke and desperate and completely alone in the world since her father's funeral 6 weeks ago, was holding the piece of paper that could ruin him. She thought about his hands. She thought about the way he had not once looked at her as anything other than a person who needed help. She folded the poster in half and walked back out into the wind. She did not give it to the sheriff. What she did not know then, could not have known standing there in the cold Abilene street with the poster tucked against her chest, was that the man on that paper was already watching her from the shadows of the livery stable across the street. He had come back. He had not been able to stop himself from coming back, and that simple fact was about to change everything about both their lives in ways neither of them had the language yet to describe. 3 days earlier, Della Walker had been precisely 31 miles from Abilene on the Kisham Trail cutoff road, and she had been losing her battle with terror. She had left Ellsworth at dawn with her wagon loaded with everything she owned in the world: 2 trunks of clothing, her father's toolbox, a crate of books, a tin box of seeds she intended to plant come spring, and the deed to 40 acres of unbroken Kansas prairie that her father had died believing was going to save their family. The deed was real, the land was real. But the man who was supposed to meet her in Abilene to help her get settled, a cousin named Roy Walker who had promised her father on his deathbed that he would look after Della, had sent a letter 2 weeks late explaining that he had moved to Denver and was terribly sorry, but he simply could not make it. Terribly sorry. That was what the letter had said. Terribly sorry. Della had read that letter sitting in a hotel room in Ellsworth, and she had made a decision that a more cautious woman might not have made. She was going to drive herself out to those 40 acres, and she was going to start building a life there with or without Roy Walker's help, because the alternative was going home to nothing, and nothing was what waited for her back east. Her father's debts had consumed the house. There was no home to go back to. There was only forward. She had hired a good horse, a gray gelding named Absalom who turned out to be calmer than his biblical name suggested, and she had loaded the wagon herself on a cold Tuesday morning and driven out of Ellsworth with her chin up and her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. For 17 miles, everything went fine. The prairie in October in 1874 had a particular kind of beauty that Della was beginning to understand was inseparable from its danger. The sky was enormous and colorless, that particular shade of pewter gray that the plain sky adopted in the weeks before the first hard freeze. The grass had gone from gold to brown, and it lay flat against the earth in the wind, the way defeated things always lay flat. The road was dry, which was a blessing, because she had heard stories about what the Kishom cutoff became when it rained, a slick red clay disaster that had swallowed wagon wheels whole and broken horses' legs. She was 17 miles out, and she was beginning to feel something close to confident, when the right rear wheel dropped into a hidden rut at the edge of the road and the axle snapped. The sound was catastrophic. It was a crack like a rifle shot, and Absalom lurched sideways and nearly came down before catching himself, and the wagon tilted hard to the right, and Della grabbed the seat rail with both hands and held on while the world went sideways around her. The wheel did not come completely off. It hung at a terrible angle, bent and broken, and the wagon sat canted in the road like a ship taking on water, and Della climbed down from the tilted seat and walked around to look at the damage and understood immediately that she was not going to fix this herself. The axle had cracked clean through on the right side, about 18 inches from the wheel hub. She had no replacement axle in the wagon. She had not thought to bring one because she had been 17 years old in her head this morning when she loaded up and drove away from Ellsworth. And 17-year-old Della Walker had believed that bravery was sufficient protection against disaster. 24-year-old Della Walker sat down in the road beside the broken wheel and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too angry to cry. She was furious at the road and furious at Roy Walker in his comfortable Denver situation, and furious at the axle for being made of metal that could apparently not withstand the simple demands of Kansas dirt. She was furious at the sky and the grass and the enormous empty silence that surrounded her on all sides for a distance that felt infinite. She was also, underneath all of that fury, beginning to be afraid in a way that had nothing to do with anger. She was alone on a road that saw maybe one other traveler a day. She had water for herself and Absalom for about 36 hours. She had food, but she had no way to move the wagon, and the land around her was flat and open, and offered not one single tree that might indicate shelter or water beyond what she already carried. She lifted her face from her hands and looked down the road in both directions. Nothing. Grass and sky and road in both directions, all the way to where the earth bent away from view. She stood up and began unhitching Absalom from the wagon, thinking she might have to ride him bareback to the nearest homestead, when she heard the sound of hooves coming from the west. She turned. He came out of the grass, not the road. That was the first strange thing about him. He was not on the road at all, but riding through the dry brown grass of the prairie itself, following what she could not see from where she stood, some line of travel that made sense to him and no one else. The horse was a bay, dark as mahogany and built for distance, and the rider sat in the saddle with the kind of easy stillness that came from years of long miles. He was not hurrying. He was not dawdling. He moved at the pace of someone who had somewhere particular to be and had planned his time around getting there without breaking his horse. He saw her wagon before he saw her, and she watched his posture shift. It was subtle, a slight straightening, a brief stillness that preceded action. Then he angled his horse toward the road and came to meet her. He was younger than she expected. She had been bracing herself for someone grizzled, someone weather-beaten to the point of roughness, because every man she had encountered on the Kansas prairie since leaving Ellsworth had looked as though the land itself had been working on them for decades. This man was perhaps 27 or 28, broad in the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar where it had grown past the point of neat trimming, and a jaw that suggested he had not shaved in perhaps 4 days. His face was tanned from outdoor living, and there was a scar along his left jaw, a thin white line that curved from his cheekbone toward his chin. He wore a gray canvas duster that was clean but old, and he had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, both of which Della noticed because a woman alone on the prairie in 1874 made a habit of noticing weapons. He pulled up 10 feet from her and looked at the wagon and then at her, and his face was unreadable in the way that faces sometimes are when the person behind them is thinking hard. "That axle is finished," he said. His voice was level and quiet, the kind of voice that did not raise itself to impress. "Yes," Della said, "I am aware." He did not smile at her directness. He studied the damage for another moment, then looked back at her, and there was a question in his expression that he did not ask out loud. "I am traveling to Abilene," she said. "I have 40 acres outside of town and I am going there to settle them." "Alone," he said. "That is the situation I find myself in," she said, which was the most honest non-answer she had available. He dismounted. He tied his bay to the far side of the wagon and went around to look at the axle himself, crouching in the road dust to examine the brake. He did not speak for a full minute. Della stood with her arms crossed and watched him, and she noted that he moved with a kind of deliberate economy, no wasted gestures, nothing performed for an audience. He was simply looking at a problem and thinking about how to solve it. "I have an iron rod in my right saddlebag," he said without looking up. "It is not a proper axle repair, but it will hold as far as Abilene if you keep to the flat ground and do not push the horse." "You carry iron rod in your saddlebag," she said, because it seemed like an unusual thing to carry. He looked up at her then, and she caught the full weight of his eyes for the first time, that brown so dark it was almost black, with something in it she could not name immediately. Cautiousness, maybe. The particular wariness of someone who had learned to measure the world carefully before letting it get too close. "I do a lot of field repairs," he said, and went back to examining the axle. She watched him work for the better part of 2 hours. He had not been exaggerating about the rod in his saddlebag. He produced it from the leather bag along with a hand wrench, a small hammer, and several lengths of wire, and he set about the business of splinting the broken axle with the focused attention of someone who had done similar work before under similar impossible conditions. He asked her once to hold a section of rod in position while he set the wire binding, and she held it steady without being asked twice, and he murmured something under his breath that might have been approval. At one point he said, "What is your name?" "Della Walker," she said. "You." A pause. Just a beat too long, the way a pause is when someone is deciding something. "Martin," he said. "Just Martin. Not Martin and a surname, just Martin, offered like a partial gift, enough to be polite and not enough to be found." She noticed. She filed it away and said nothing about it because she had enough troubles of her own without inserting herself into whatever troubles a man alone on the Kansas prairie with iron rod in his saddlebag might be carrying. He straightened up and tested the repair by pushing hard against the wheel hub with both hands and watching the way the joint held. "That will do," he said, and began gathering his tools. "What do I owe you?" Della asked. She had $3 in her coat pocket, which was nearly everything she had until she got to the land office in Abilene. He shook his head. "Nothing." "I insist," she said. "You have spent 2 hours on a stranger's axle. You should be compensated." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely decode, something between warmth and distance, like a fire seen through a window. "Keep your money," he said. "You are going to need it more than I do." He untied his horse. He checked the cinch and put his foot in the stirrup and swung up, and he looked down at her from the saddle for a moment in the gray October afternoon light, and she had the sudden strange feeling that he was memorizing her face, that he was looking at her the way you looked at a place you were leaving and were not sure you would ever come back to. "Stay to the center of the road and keep the pace slow," he said. "The repair will hold." He touched the brim of his hat, 2 fingers. A gesture that was somehow both formal and intimate, an acknowledgement that held more than its small motion contained. Then he rode east, back into the grass, not the road, and the prairie swallowed him as completely and quickly as though he had never been there at all. Della stood in the road for a long moment after he was gone, her hand raised halfway to call something after him. Some proper thank you. Some acknowledgement of what he had given her. Not just the repaired axle, but the specific kindness of treating her like someone capable of understanding what was happening without being talked down to or alarmed. She stood there with her unspoken thank you hanging in the cold air, and then she climbed back up onto the wagon seat and took up Absalom's reins and drove herself to Abilene, arriving after dark, and the axle held every single mile. She had been awake half the night thinking about a man she knew only as Martin. Then the wanted poster had appeared under her door, and the world had rearranged itself around a new and deeply uncomfortable truth. Martin Cooper. The name under the sketch had a weight to it that the half-name she had been given did not. Martin Cooper was a specific person with a specific history, and that history included 5 federal warrants and a reward large enough to solve most of the practical problems in Della Walker's immediate life. She stood in the wind outside the sheriff's office with the poster tucked against her chest, and she made the most consequential decision of her life so far, which was to do absolutely nothing with the information she had been given. She did not examine why she made that decision too carefully. She was practical enough to understand that examining it too carefully would lead her to a conclusion she was not ready to face, which was that she had developed feelings for a man after 2 hours on a dusty road, which was an embarrassing and inconvenient truth that she preferred to leave unexamined for the time being. She walked back to her boarding house on the main street of Abilene, which was a town of approximately 3,000 souls in October of 1874, a cattle town still riding the last years of the great trail drives before the railroads changed everything, and the Longhorns stopped coming north. The streets were wide and rutted and smelled of cattle and horses and wood smoke, and the buildings along the main street were the particular mixture of permanent and temporary that characterized every Kansas cow town. Solid brick banks and hotels next to canvas-sided saloons that looked as though they might blow away in a strong wind. Her boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Calvert, a sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had strong opinions about the proper hours for male visitors and the dangers of drinking water from the public pump. Della liked her enormously. She was halfway up the porch steps of the boarding house when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Walker." She spun around. Martin Cooper was standing at the edge of the boardwalk in the shadow thrown by the front of the dry goods store next door, and he was looking at her with an expression that was equal parts careful and urgent, and she realized with a shock that went through her like cold water that he had been watching her come out of the sheriff's office. He had seen the poster in her hands. He had seen her fold it and walk away without going inside. "You did not turn me in," he said. It was not quite a question. More an observation being processed in real time. "No," she said. They looked at each other across 12 feet of Abilene boardwalk in the gray afternoon light, and the wind moved between them like a third presence. "Why not?" he said. "You fixed my axle," she said. Something shifted in his face. It was subtle enough that she might have missed it if she had not been paying very close attention, which she was. Something softened around his eyes and hardened around his jaw simultaneously, which was a combination she found impossible to interpret and deeply compelling. "That is not sufficient reason to protect a wanted man," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." Silence between them stretched out thin and taut like a wire pulled to the edge of its tolerance. "You should go inside," he said. "Forget you saw me." "That seems unlikely," she said honestly. He looked at her for another long moment. The wind pushed a scrap of paper down the street between them and they both watched it go, which gave them both a reason to look away from each other for a moment which felt necessary. "I came back to make sure you reached Abilene safely," he said finally. "The repair held." "Every mile," she said. He nodded. He should have left then. He should have turned and walked away and disappeared again into whatever shadow he had ridden in from. But he stood there for another moment with the wind in his coat and his hat pulled low against the cold, and Della stood on the porch steps and did not go inside, and the air between them felt the way the air felt before a storm, charged and anticipatory, and carrying the sense of something about to happen that could not be stopped. "Will you have coffee with me?" she asked. She surprised herself with the question. She had not planned it. It arrived on her tongue, fully formed from somewhere she had not consulted, the part of her that apparently operated independently of her better judgment. Martin Cooper looked at the street and looked at the sky and looked back at her, and she could see him arguing with himself about it. "There is a diner on the cross street," she said. "I will not ask you questions you do not want to answer. I will not pretend I did not see that poster. I would simply like to have coffee with the man who fixed my wagon before the world makes that impossible." He exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that preceded a decision you already knew you were going to regret and were making anyway because the alternative was somehow worse. "All right," he said. The diner was called Miller's, and it smelled of coffee and beef stew and the particular warmth of a wood stove working hard against an October chill. There were 4 other customers scattered at the small wooden tables, and nobody looked up when they came in. The woman behind the counter was deep in a conversation with a rancher about the price of winter feed, and she waved them toward a table in the back without really seeing them. They sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee between them, and the lamplight in the diner was warm and yellow and made everything feel safer than it was. "You are not from Kansas," she said. It was not a question. His voice had something in it, a slight flatness on certain vowels that she associated with somewhere north, Minnesota maybe, or Wisconsin. "Wisconsin," he said, "originally. How does a man from Wisconsin end up on a wanted poster in Kansas?" "I told you no questions," he said. "I told you I would not ask questions you did not want to answer," she corrected. "That implies a category of questions you might be willing to answer." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her over the rim, and she had the feeling again of being really seen by him, not assessed or catalogued the way men sometimes looked at women in public places, but actually seen. "The railroad," he said finally. "I worked for the Kansas Pacific for 3 years as a surveyor. I found something in the company's records that I was not supposed to find." "What did you find?" "Evidence that the railroad was fraudulently claiming land grants," he said. "Thousands of acres of land that belonged to settlers and to the federal government being transferred through falsified documents to company executives. The kind of theft that looks like paperwork from the outside but ruins people's lives from the inside." Della thought about her 40 acres. She thought about the deed in her trunk upstairs at the boarding house, the deed her father had spent his last 3 years working and saving to secure. "Go on," she said quietly. "I brought the documents to the federal land office in Topeka," he said. "And then I discovered that the man running the land office had been paid by the railroad to look the other way. I was carrying stolen company documents. That is the legal version of what I am. A man who stole documents to expose theft, and who is now being hunted by the people whose theft he tried to expose." The room was very quiet. A log shifted in the stove. "The wanted poster says robbery," Della said. "The railroad writes the warrants," he said. "They have the judges." She looked at him for a long time. She was a school teacher. She was not naive about the way power worked in 1874 Kansas. She had watched the cattle companies roll through Ellsworth and Abilene and reshape the towns to suit themselves, watched small farmers get squeezed off bottomland because someone with money and connections decided that land should belong to someone else. She had watched the railroads arrive like civilizing forces and understood, quietly and without being able to say so in mixed company, that civilization was sometimes another word for organized taking. "Where are the documents now?" she said. He looked at her sharply. "You said they were stolen. Where are they?" "I have them," he said. "Then why are you still here?" she said. "If you have evidence of fraud, there must be someone in the federal government who does not belong to the railroad, a senator, a proper federal judge." "I have been trying to reach Senator Ingalls of Kansas for 4 months," he said. "Every time I get close, the railroad's men get between us. I think they have someone watching his office." Every letter I have tried to send has disappeared." Della thought carefully before she spoke again. "I am going to a land office tomorrow morning," she said, "to register my deed. I have letters of introduction to two men in Abilene who were friends of my father's, one of whom is a federal land agent and one of whom is a cattle broker who has, as I understand it, significant grievances against the Kansas Pacific over a freight dispute." Martin Cooper set down his coffee cup very carefully. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I am suggesting that a woman going to register a deed is considerably less suspicious than a wanted man trying to make contact with federal authorities," she said. "I am suggesting that the documents you are carrying might find their way to the correct people if they were delivered by the correct intermediary." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. This one had weight and consequence in it. "You would be making yourself part of this," he said. "If the railroad found out you helped me, they would not be gentle about it." "My father's land might be on the fraudulent grants list," she said. "My 40 acres. The deed I have spent 6 weeks convincing myself is real." She looked at him steadily. "I have a personal interest in this, Martin Cooper. I am not doing this purely from the goodness of my heart." He looked at her for a long time. There was something happening in his expression that she could see but not entirely read, some internal reckoning being conducted in real time. Then he said something she did not expect. "Your land is not on the fraudulent list," he said. "I know because I have the list. The grants they falsified were all in the western counties. Barton County, Pawnee County, Rush County, not Dickinson County. Your deed is clean." Della absorbed this. She felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been holding so continuously that she had forgotten it was there, the fear that the one solid thing she had left might turn out to be another lie. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me that." "You would have found out eventually," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it is different to know now." They sat with their coffee in the warm lamplight, and outside the wind had picked up and was coming down the main street of Abilene with everything it had, rattling signs and pulling at everything that was not tied down, and inside the diner it was quiet and warm and close. The other customers drifted out one by one. The woman behind the counter began wiping down the tables at the far end of the room. "Why did you come back?" Della asked. "You said you came to make sure I reached Abilene safely, but you could have confirmed that without showing yourself." He looked down at his coffee cup. "I could have," he agreed. "So why did you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I could not stop thinking about the look on your face when your axle broke," he said finally. "That look of not despair exactly, more like someone who was absolutely determined not to be defeated and was having to work very hard at it." Della felt warmth move up her neck. "I was afraid," she said honestly. "I do not mind admitting it now." "I know," he said. "That is what made it interesting. You were afraid and you were not going to let it stop you. I found that I do not know, worth returning to." She looked at him very directly. "That is a dangerous thing to admit," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. "I know." The woman behind the counter was working her way toward their table with her cloth. The evening was thinning toward night. In the morning, Della would go to the land office and Martin Cooper would still be a wanted man, and the world outside would still be cold and complicated. But for this hour in Miller's diner in Abilene, they sat across from each other and talked about Wisconsin and about teaching school in the territories and about the particular silence of the Kansas prairie that was different from all other silences. And the lamplight was golden and the coffee was hot, and something was beginning between them that neither of them had permission for, and neither of them was going to stop. He walked her back to the boarding house. It was a short walk in the cold dark, and they walked with a careful distance between them, not touching, their breath visible in the lamplight thrown by the windows of the businesses on the main street. At the foot of the porch steps he stopped. "Tomorrow," he said, "the land office. If you are willing to carry the documents, I will give them to you tonight. I can tell you what to ask for and who to speak to." "All right," she said. "And Della," he said. The use of her given name stopped her, made her turn. He had not used it before. If anything goes wrong, if anyone asks where you got them, you tell them you found them. In your wagon. Tucked behind the seat. I will not do that, she said. You have to, he said. I will not throw you to the wolves to protect myself, she said firmly. You have to, he said again, and the intensity in his voice was different from anything she had heard from him before, raw and urgent. I have been running from these people for 4 months, Della. I know what they do. You will not be safe if they connect you to me directly. You have to promise me. She looked at him in the dark. His face was very serious, and the scar along his jaw was a pale crescent in the lamplight, and she had the overwhelming urge to put her hand against his face, and was horrified at herself for it. I promise, she said, and she said it meaning it. He reached inside his coat and produced a thick envelope sealed with plain wax, and he held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, just a brush of cold skin against cold skin, and they both went very still for a moment. Ask for Deputy Commissioner Hallett, he said. Not the main land commissioner. Hallett. He was brought in from Washington 18 months ago, and he has no ties to the local railroad interests. Tell him you found these in your wagon and that you believe them to be important government documents. And then what? She said. Then I will take it from there, he said. You will not disappear, she said. It came out more urgently than she intended, almost a demand, and she heard herself say it and could not take it back and was not sure she wanted to. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. I will not disappear, he said. Not until this is settled. She went inside and lay awake for a long time with the envelope on the nightstand beside her, and the wind outside was very loud, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the particular quality of a man's face when he was telling the truth, and what it meant that she was almost certain she had seen that quality in Martin Cooper's face all evening. The land office was a brick building 3 doors down from the hotel on the cross street, and Della arrived there at 9 in the morning in her best dress, which was a dark green wool that her mother had made for her 4 years ago, and which still fit if she breathed carefully. She had the envelope in her handbag. She had rehearsed what she was going to say 4 times on the walk over. The main room of the office smelled of ink and paper, and the particular dusty warmth of government buildings. 2 clerks worked at tall desks behind a wooden railing. She asked for Deputy Commissioner Hallett, and one of the clerks disappeared into the back, and she stood waiting with her hands folded over her handbag and her heart conducting a lively argument with her ribcage. Deputy Commissioner Hallett was a thin, precise man of perhaps 40 with spectacles and ink stains on his right hand, and he looked at her over the rims of his glasses with the expression of a man who was habitually busy and occasionally interrupted by people who turned out to be worth the interruption. Miss Walker, he said, how can I help you? She registered her deed first. That was the practical business, the official reason for her visit, and she went through it carefully, presenting the documents, answering the clerk's questions, watching the deed get entered into the territorial register in a careful copperplate hand. The land was hers, officially and permanently, 40 acres in Dickinson County, and when the clerk handed the stamped copy back to her, she felt something solidify deep in her chest, the only solid thing in a world that had been moving under her feet for weeks. Then she asked Deputy Commissioner Hallett if she could speak to him privately. In his office, with the door closed, she put the envelope on his desk. I found these in my wagon, she said, tucked behind the seat. I came from Ellsworth and I do not know when they got there, but from what I can read of them I believe they are important. Hallett picked up the envelope. He broke the seal and looked at the first several pages inside, and Della watched his face, and the expression that moved across it was not what she expected. It was not confusion or skepticism. It was recognition. He had seen documents like these before, or heard of them, or been waiting for something exactly like them, because his face went through several rapid changes, surprise and then something that was almost relief, and then a careful blankness that was the face of a man remembering to control his reactions. Where exactly did you find these? He said. Behind the seat of my wagon, she said. I drove in from Ellsworth on the Kishom Cutoff Road. I had some trouble with a broken axle along the way." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Walker," he said carefully, "these documents, if they are what they appear to be, represent a significant legal matter. I am going to need to ask you to stay in Abilene for the time being, in case federal investigators have further questions. Can you arrange to do that?" "I have 40 acres in Dickinson County," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Good," he said. He stood and held out his hand, and she shook it, and his handshake was firm and dry and meant something about what he intended to do with what she had just given him. She walked out of the land office into the October sunshine and felt simultaneously lighter and more frightened than she had since the axle broke, because she had just participated in something considerably larger than herself, and the question of where it was going to land was entirely out of her hands. Martin was waiting for her in the alley beside the dry goods store. He stepped out when he saw her coming, and she went directly to him, and the expression on his face when he saw hers told her that he had already read the outcome in the way she was walking. "He took them," she said. Martin closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something in them that she had not seen before, a washing out of the constant watchfulness, a moment of something that might have been safety. "Thank you," he said. "Now what?" she said. "Now I wait," he said. "Hallett will need time to verify the documents, contact Washington. It could be 2 weeks, could be a month. During that time, the railroad's men will still be looking for me." "Then stay out of sight," she said. "That is the plan," he said dryly. "I have 40 acres outside of town," she said, and she heard herself say it before she had consciously decided to. "There is nothing on it yet but land. But there is a creek and a place where a person could camp without being easily found." He looked at her very carefully. "I am offering you a safe place to wait," she said. "Not charity, not sentiment, practical assistance during a legal process that may take weeks and that directly affects my interests as well as yours." "I am a wanted man," he said. "If someone sees me on your land, it creates problems for you." "Then be careful," she said. "I can." "Della," he said, and the way he said her name was careful and warm and careful again, like something he was learning the weight of. "Yes," she said. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "And I do not want the practical answer. I want the honest one." She looked at him in the alley in Abilene with the October sun coming in at an angle over the rooftops and making everything gold and ordinary and impossibly significant. "Because you came back," she said. "You had no reason to come back, and you did, and I cannot stop thinking about that." The silence was very full. "That is a dangerous reason," he said. "I know," she said. "Tell me you do not feel the same thing, and I will walk away from this conversation and pretend it never happened." He did not tell her that. He looked at her for a long moment with the October light on his face and the old scar along his jaw and those dark, careful, honest eyes, and he did not say anything at all, and the silence said everything. They rode out to the 40 acres the following morning, Della in her wagon with the repaired axle holding steady and Martin trailing behind on his bay, staying off the road the way he seemed to prefer, visible to her, but not to anyone, looking only at the road. The land came into view as they crested a long, low rise, and it was nothing yet, just 40 acres of brown-grassed prairie with a line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge, marking the course of the creek Martin had mentioned. The sky above it was enormous, and the wind moved the grass in long rolling waves, and it was not beautiful in the way of soft places, but it had a raw and honest quality that struck Della as right, as fitting, as something she could build a life in. They camped that first night on opposite sides of a fire, which was practical and necessary, and also something neither of them acknowledged. The cottonwoods along the creek gave them shelter from the wind, and the fire was small and had a particular kind of warmth that fires have when two people are keeping each other company. Martin produced dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebag, and Della produced a tin of preserved peaches that she had packed in Ellsworth because they were her favorite, and she had decided, that Tuesday morning loading the wagon, that she was going to have at least one luxury in her new life. They ate together in the firelight, And Martin talked about surveying, about the particular discipline of learning to read land the way you would read a sentence, for the information encoded in its surface. He talked about 3 years of walking Kansas ahead of the railroad crews, learning watersheds and gradients, and the way soil changed character from one county to the next. He talked about it the way people talk about work they were genuinely suited for, with a kind of quiet fluency. She talked about teaching school in the territories, about the one-room schoolhouse outside of Ellsworth where she had taught for 18 months, 31 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old, 2 languages, 3 different levels of reading ability, and one very opinionated school board that felt strongly that geography was a waste of time, and she felt equally strongly was essential. She talked about it the way she talked about everything, directly and without embellishment, and she noticed that Martin listened the way he did everything, with complete attention. "You miss it," he said, "teaching." "I miss the children," she said. "I miss the work. I do not miss the school board." She looked across the fire at him. "I intend to start a school out here eventually, when there are enough children on the homesteads nearby to justify it." "How long before that?" he said. 2, 3 years maybe," she said. "The settlements are moving this way. In 2 years there will be enough families." She looked around at the darkness surrounding the fire, at the grass and the sky and the creek murmuring somewhere nearby in the dark. "I know it does not look like much yet," she said. "It looks like a beginning," he said. He said it simply and without any quality of performance, and she believed him completely. The days that followed had a particular quality that Della would spend years afterward trying to properly describe and never quite succeeding. They were days of very hard work, because she had a winter coming and nowhere yet to shelter, and Martin Cooper turned out to be a man of extraordinary practical competence, who appeared to regard having nothing to do during a period of enforced waiting as a personal affront. He helped her level a site for a cabin near the cottonwoods, not building it. They did not have the lumber, but preparing the ground and marking the dimensions and cutting and stacking the cottonwood poles that would make the frame when the lumber arrived from Abilene. He dug a proper fire ring and a wind break. He fixed the second wheel on the wagon that had been slightly loose since Ellsworth, without being asked, just noticing it and fixing it. In the evenings they talked. They talked about everything. They talked about the things that mattered and the things that did not, about books they had read and places they had been, and what they thought the country was becoming. Martin had a mind that moved quickly and carefully, that tested ideas before committing to them, that was willing to be wrong and say so, which she found rare and valuable. She had a mind that saw connections between apparently unrelated things and that formed opinions fast and held them firmly unless given genuine reason to revise them, which he found, he told her on the 4th evening, honestly bracing. "Bracing," she repeated. "I mean it as a compliment," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. On the 5th day she was by the creek filling the water bucket when she turned and found him standing on the bank above her, watching her with the particular expression that had been appearing on his face more frequently over the past several days. The one she had decided was the face he made when he was feeling something he had not decided how to handle. "What?" she said, straightforward as always. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that I have not had this in a long time." "What is this?" she said, genuinely asking. He thought about it. "Company," he said finally. "The kind where you are not performing anything for anyone, where you can just be what you are." She looked up at him from the bank of the creek. "You are what you are," she said. "I hope you know that the things I can see of you are, without exception, good things." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he came down the bank to where she was standing, and he was very close, close enough that she could see the detail of his face in the afternoon light, the darkness of his eyes and the old scar and the particular earnestness that was always underneath the caution. "Della," he said, "I need you to understand something. I do not know what Hallett finds when he digs into these documents. I do not know if the warrants against me get cleared or if they stand. I cannot offer you a future with any certainty in it." "Who can?" she said quietly. "Most people," he said. "No," she said. "Most people just pretend they can, An axle breaks. A deed turns out to be fraudulent. A cousin moves to Denver. Certainty is a story people tell themselves. I would rather have something real with no guarantees than a guarantee that has nothing real behind it. He was very still for a moment, and then his hand came up and touched her face, gently, his thumb along her jaw and an echo of the scar along his own. And she turned her face slightly into his hand the way she had wanted to since the night outside the boarding house, and the world was very quiet around them. "I am going to do everything in my power to resolve this," he said, "and then I am going to ask you something that I do not have the right to ask you right now." "I will answer yes," she said before he could say what the question was. He looked at her with those honest dark eyes, and the side of his mouth moved in the particular way it moved when he was trying not to smile and losing the fight. "You do not even know what I am going to ask," he said. "I do not need to," she said. He kissed her. It was careful and unhurried and completely certain, the kiss of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. And she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating, which was rapid and strong and entirely human. And the creek ran beside them, and the cottonwood leaves stirred above them, and the sky was enormous, and the world was wide and complicated and full of danger, and she was, for the first time since she could remember, not afraid. The letter came 10 days later. It came to the land office in Abilene and was addressed to Della Walker, care of the Abilene Land Office, which suggested that Deputy Commissioner Hallett had used her as a formal point of contact in the process Martin had begun. She rode in from the homestead to collect it on a Monday, and she read it standing in the street outside the land office with the wind in her hair and the letter shaking slightly in her hands. Hallett had sent the documents to the federal land commissioner in Washington. A federal investigator named Bryce had been dispatched from Washington to Kansas. The Kansas Pacific's fraudulent grant claims had been temporarily suspended pending investigation. Martin Cooper's warrants were under formal review, and Della was requested to present herself and any witnesses at the Abilene Federal Court building on Thursday of that week. She rode back to the homestead at a gallop. Martin read the letter twice and was very still for a long time. "They suspended the grants," he said. "Yes," she said. That is significant," he said. "That means Hallett had enough in the documents to act on immediately." "Thursday," she said. "Federal court in Abilene." He looked at her steadily. "This could still go wrong," he said. "A federal investigator arriving does not mean the warrants are cleared. It means they are being examined. There is a difference." "I know," she said, "but it means someone in Washington is paying attention." He was quiet for another moment, and then he looked at her with a directness that had nothing guarded in it. "Whatever happens Thursday," he said, "I want you to know that these days have been something I did not expect to have in my life, something I would not trade." "Do not make it sound like a farewell," she said firmly. "I am not," he said. "I am making it sound like the truth, which it is." "The truth is also going to include Thursday," she said, "and we are going to face it together." He looked at her for a moment, and then he put his hand on the side of her face again, which had become something he did when he was feeling something too large for words. She had noticed, and she leaned into it the way she always did, and they stood there in the cold October air on 40 acres of raw Kansas prairie that was just beginning to feel like home. Thursday arrived with a cold, clear sky and a hard frost that silvered the grass and made the cottonwood leaves sound like paper in the wind. They rode into Abilene together on that morning, which was a decision Della made and Martin did not argue with, both of them understanding that it was a declaration of something, a public alignment that couldn't be taken back. The federal court building was the same brick building that housed the land office, with an additional meeting room at the back that had been pressed into court service. Investigator Bryce was a square, plain-spoken man from Ohio, who had the look of someone who had spent the better part of 20 years sorting through the consequences of other people's dishonesty, and had arrived at a state of functional equanimity about it. He shook Della's hand and Martin's hand with equal firmness and directed them to chairs and opened a folder. The hearing was not quick and it was not comfortable. Bryce asked detailed questions about the documents, about how Martin had obtained them, about the timeline of the original discovery, about every attempt Martin had made to reach Senator Ingalls. Martin answered everything with the same directness and calm that Della had come to recognize as his natural register, the register of someone with nothing left to hide and nothing to gain from performance. Hallett testified about the documents and what they showed. A clerk read lengthy portions of the grant records aloud. At one point, a man came in from the back of the room and whispered something in Bryce's ear, and Bryce's expression changed in a way that was significant. "Mr. Cooper," Bryce said, "I have just been informed that the Kansas Pacific's Chief Counsel has filed a response to our request for their grant documentation. They have invoked a contractual privilege claim." "They will not produce the originals," Martin said flatly. "That is correct," Bryce said. "Which, as you may know, creates something of an inference in the law." Martin looked at him steadily. "I also have a telegram here from Washington," Bryce continued, "received this morning from the office of Senator John James Ingalls of Kansas, who indicates that he has been trying to receive documentation regarding Kansas Pacific land grant fraud for several months and is very interested in the materials forwarded by this office." Della felt the air change in the room. It was subtle but definite, the way air changed before a storm broke, the atmospheric shift that preceded the actual rain. Bryce folded his hands on the desk. "Mr. Cooper," he said, "the warrants against you were issued at the direct request of the Kansas Pacific Railroad based on charges of document theft. In light of what these documents contain, and in light of the railroad's refusal to produce original materials, and in light of Senator Ingalls' interest in this matter, I am recommending to the Federal Land Commissioner that these warrants be suspended pending full investigation." He paused. "That means you are not a free man in the absolute legal sense yet, but you are a man who is no longer being actively hunted, and I expect that within 60 days the formal charges will be dismissed." Martin Cooper sat very still. "60 days," he said. "At the most," Bryce said, "possibly less." Martin looked at Della. She looked back at him. The expression on his face was one she had never seen before because she had not known him during a time when the weight he was carrying was anything other than constant. And watching it shift, watching something that had been pressing down on him for months begin to lift in real time, was one of the most moving things she had ever witnessed. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. He held it with both of his, hard and sure. After the hearing, they walked out into the cold Abilene street and stood in the pale October sunlight, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "It is not over," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is nearly over." 60 days, he said. "During which time," she said, "I intend to get the lumber delivered and the cabin framed before the first hard freeze. So if you have any objection to spending 60 days on a Kansas homestead, you should say so now." He looked at her with the side of his mouth doing what it always did when he was losing the fight with a smile. "I have no objection," he said. The next 60 days were the most genuinely happy days of Della Walker's life to that point, and she recognized them as such while they were happening, which she had always heard was rare. The lumber arrived from Abilene on the last day of October, and she and Martin built the cabin together, a one-room structure with a proper wood floor and 2 windows, and a stone fireplace that Martin built with the same precise attention he gave to everything, using stones from the creek bed and mortar he had Della mix while he set the courses. The fireplace drew perfectly on the first night they lit it, and they sat in front of it on a blanket with tin cups of coffee and watched the flames and said very little, because some contentment is too large for talk. The first snow came in early November, light and dry, and it lay on the prairie in a thin white sheet that made everything look both cleaner and more fragile than it had before. Della stood in the doorway of the new cabin on the morning of the first snow and looked out at 40 acres of Kansas that were hers, that had the beginning of a structure on them, a cleared garden plot and a frame for a small outbuilding and a proper fire ring, and she thought about her father and wished he could see it. Martin came and stood behind her in the doorway, and she could feel the warmth of him at her back without touching. He would have been pleased, he said. He had known about her father from the evenings by the fire, from the slow and natural accumulation of everything she had told him about her life. Yes, she said. I think he would have been. She leaned back slightly, and he put his arms around her from behind, which was something they had arrived at naturally over the past weeks, this easy physical closeness that contained both affection and comfort and was entirely uncomplicated, which neither of them had expected. Tell me about Wisconsin, she said. Tell me about your family. He was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 12, he said. My father remarried, and there were 2 younger brothers who are probably, last I knew, still working the family farm outside of Green Bay. I have not been able to contact them since this all started. I did not want to put them in the path of it. When this is resolved, she said, you should write to them. Yes, he said simply. And I want to meet them, she said, eventually, if that is all right. His arms tightened around her briefly. More than all right, he said. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of November. It came from Investigator Bryce's office and was waiting for Della at the Abilene post office when she rode in for supplies. It was brief and official and contained the most significant 4 sentences she had read in her life since the deed to 40 acres. The Kansas Pacific's fraudulent grant claims had been formally vacated. An indictment had been returned against 3 company executives and the compromised land commissioner in Topeka. All warrants issued at the request of the Kansas Pacific against Martin Cooper were formally dismissed. Martin Cooper was a free man. She read it 3 times standing at the post office counter with the postmaster watching her patiently. Then she rode home at a dead gallop. He was splitting firewood behind the cabin when she came in, and he looked up at the sound of the horse and saw her face and set down the axe and was walking toward her before she had even fully stopped. She held out the telegram. He read it. Once, twice. The 3rd time more slowly, as though he needed to verify that the words were not changing, that they continued to say what they had said the first 2 times. Then he looked up at her, and his face was something she had no adequate words for, wide open in a way it almost never was, all the careful watchfulness gone for a moment, and just the man himself visible underneath. She had already climbed down from Absalom. She walked directly to him and he caught her, and they held each other in the cold November air behind the cabin with the firewood and the axe and the flat white sky above them, and Della felt tears on her face, which surprised her, because she had not known she was going to cry. It is over, she said against his shoulder. It is over, he agreed, and his voice was rougher than usual, the roughness of emotion that a person did not entirely choose. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his hand came up to the side of her face the way it always did, and he looked at her with all that honesty she had come to rely on the way she relied on the soundness of the ground under her feet. I told you 10 days ago that I had something I wanted to ask you when I had the right, he said. I have the right now. Yes, she said again before he asked, because she had been saying yes to this specific question in her heart for weeks. He laughed, which was a sound she loved, warm and genuine. You are not going to let me ask it properly, are you? You can ask it properly, she said. I will still have already answered. He took her hands in both of his. They were standing in the thin November sunlight behind the cabin on 40 acres of Kansas prairie, and he was a free man now, and she was a woman who had driven herself into the frontier alone with a tin of preserved peaches and an unshakable conviction that life got better if you kept moving west, and they looked at each other with everything that the past months had made between them. Della Walker, he said, I was a man with nothing to offer and no fixed place in the world. I still cannot tell you exactly what I am building or exactly where it will go, but I know that I want to build it with you, on this ground in this life. I know that I have not felt like myself in 4 years, and you gave that back to me in ways I do not fully understand and am enormously grateful for. I know that I love you, and I am asking you to marry me. She put both hands on his face. Martin Cooper, she said. Yes, Absolutely and entirely yes. He kissed her in the November sunlight, and it was nothing like the careful kiss by the creek, which had been beautiful but tentative. This was certain. This was the kiss of two people who had arrived somewhere after a long journey and recognized the place as home. They were married in Abilene on the 14th of December in 1874, in the small Methodist church on the cross street, with Mrs. Calvert from the boarding house as witness and Deputy Commissioner Hallett as the second witness, and the preacher was a young man named Reverend Abbott who performed the ceremony with great earnestness and not much experience, which Della found entirely charming. Martin wore a dark coat she had not seen before, which he had acquired in Abilene in the days before the wedding without telling her, and he looked so genuinely handsome and so earnestly nervous in it that she had to look away briefly when she came down the short aisle to keep her composure. He did not look away from her for a single moment. After the ceremony, they drove back out to the homestead in the wagon, in the pale, cold December afternoon, and the cabin had a fire in it, and the tin of preserved peaches she had been hoarding was still in the crate of supplies from Ellsworth, and they ate them that evening by the fire with a kind of ceremonial deliberateness. "You have been carrying those since Ellsworth," he said. "They were for a special occasion," she said. "Was the occasion specific enough?" he said. "More than enough," she said. He wrote to his brothers in Green Bay that same week, a long letter explaining everything: the 4 months of running, the documents, the investigation, the dismissal of the charges. He told them about Della. He told them about the 40 acres in Dickinson County, Kansas. He told them he was well and settled and had never been happier. He mailed it from Abilene on a cold, bright December morning, and they waited for the reply. It came in January, when the Kansas prairie was under a foot of snow, and the creek had frozen over, and the world outside the cabin was white and absolute and still. The letter was from both brothers, Henry and George, written in a scramble of 2 different handwritings on the same pages, one brother's line of news followed by the other's, interrupted by the other. A chaotic and affectionate document that made Martin laugh in a way Della had not heard from him before, the laugh of someone reuniting with something they had lost. He read portions aloud to her, and she sat beside him on the bench near the fireplace, and listened and felt something warm and solid settle deeper into the life they were making. Spring came to the homestead the way spring comes to the Kansas prairie, not gradually but in a rush, a great exhalation of green and mud and wind and noise after the long silence of winter. Della planted her garden in April, the seeds she had carried from Ellsworth in the tin box, and the garden plot Martin had cleared in November received them with the particular enthusiasm of well-prepared soil. She planted corn and beans and squash and a kitchen garden of herbs and roots along the south wall of the cabin, where the light was best. Martin had been working through the late winter on the problem of the land survey. With his warrants cleared and his skills and his history with the Kansas Pacific no longer a liability, he had opened conversations with the Federal Land Office about work as an independent surveyor for homestead claims in the area. Dickinson County was receiving settlers at an increasing pace as the trails stabilized, and the word spread about the quality of the soil, and every new claim needed to be properly surveyed and recorded, and there was not a surplus of men with the training and experience to do it. Hallett had been instrumental, writing a formal recommendation that described Martin's surveillance work for the Kansas Pacific in terms that made the 3 years of that experience a credential rather than a liability. By March of 1875, Martin Cooper had a contract with the Federal Land Office and a territory of claims to survey that would keep him busy through the fall at minimum. He came home in the evenings from the survey work dusty and tired, and with that look on his face that she recognized as the look of someone doing work they were genuinely made for. He told her what he had seen during the day, the new claims going in, the families arriving with their wagons and their children, and their particular mixture of hope and fear, that she recognized as the exact mixture she had been carrying herself 14 months ago. He told her about a young couple named Svensson from Minnesota who had claimed 80 acres 2 miles north of their homestead and who had 3 young children and no English. And Della said immediately that she would go and visit, because a woman with 3 children and no English on a new claim in Kansas in the spring needed a neighbor. She visited the Svenssons on a Tuesday in April and came home with a kind of purposefulness about her that Martin recognized as the return of the schoolteacher he had heard so much about. "They have 4 children, not 3, she said. "The baby was born on the wagon 3 weeks ago. The oldest is 7 and has never been to school. There are 2 other families with children within 2 miles. I am going to start a school. Here," he said, gesturing at the cabin. "Here until I can build a proper schoolhouse," she said. "Mrs. Svensson is willing to help, and there is a woman named Ada Clark 2 miles east who taught school in Ohio and wants to help. With 3 adults and 8 children, we have the beginnings of something." She looked at him with that look she had that was entirely certain and slightly daring him to object. "I was not going to object," he said mildly. "Good," she said. The school opened in the cabin in May of 1875 with 9 children of 5 different family origins, conducted in English with a significant amount of improvised sign language, and the occasional use of the blackboard Martin had built and mounted on the south wall of the cabin in early April, as though he had known all along it was going to be needed. It was crowded and imperfect, and the children were noisy and eager, and the days were long, and Della came to bed at night with chalk dust on her hands and her mind still full of the particular satisfactions of the work. In June, she discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Martin on a warm June evening when the fireflies were beginning in the grass along the creek, sitting outside on the bench he had built against the south wall of the cabin, and he went very still when she told him, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she would always be glad she was paying close enough attention to catch, because it was completely unguarded and completely joyful and entirely beautiful. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am a school teacher," she said. "I know how to count." He put his arms around her and held her in the June evening air and said nothing, which was enough. "We are going to need a larger cabin," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said, smiling against her hair. Their son was born in February of 1876, on a cold, clear morning when the prairie was under fresh snow, and the creek was frozen, and the sky was the particular blue that Kansas sky achieved in winter, that deep, pure color that had no equivalent anywhere else. He arrived early in the morning after a labor that was hard and long, and attended by Mrs. Svensson and Ada Clark, and a Dr. Della had insisted on having present, a young physician named Dr. Marsh from Abilene whom Martin had ridden for in the night, and who arrived somewhat breathless and entirely competent. They named him William James Cooper, after Della's father whose middle name had been James, and he was large and healthy and apparently deeply invested in making his opinions about the world known immediately, judging by the volume of his arrival. Martin held his son for the first time standing by the window of the cabin with the winter light coming in, and Della watched him from the bed where she had been instructed by Dr. Marsh to remain horizontal, and the expression on his face was the most open thing she had ever seen on another human being, complete and tender and a little overwhelmed, and she loved him so fiercely in that moment that it was nearly physical. "Hello, William," Martin said quietly to the baby, who regarded him with the unfocused intensity that new babies brought to all encounters. "I am your father. You have a great deal to learn about Kansas, and I am going to help with that." "He is 30 minutes old," Della said from the bed. "It is not too early to start," Martin said, and he looked up at her with that side of the mouth movement that had become one of her most beloved things in the world. The schoolhouse was built in the summer of 1876. It was a proper one-room building on a small lot near the Svensson claim that 3 homesteading families had contributed labor and lumber to build, and it had 8 proper desks that Martin built himself over the winter, and a real blackboard mounted on the north wall, and a pot-bellied stove for the winter months. Ada Clark had taken on the formal teaching duties when the school grew past the point where one person could manage alone, and she and Della divided the classes between them, and the school served 14 children by the fall of 1876 and 19 by the spring of 1877. Martin's survey work had expanded. He had 3 assistants by 1877, and a formal arrangement with the Abilene Federal Land Office that gave him responsibility for the surveying of all homestead claims in a territory of 3 counties. He was building, quietly and without drama, exactly the kind of practice that his 3 years with the Kansas Pacific had prepared him for, but this time in service of the people filing the claims rather than the company appropriating them. Senator Ingalls, with whom Martin had corresponded regularly since the investigation concluded, had cited the Kansas Pacific case in 2 Senate speeches about land fraud in the territories, without naming Martin directly, which was a discretion Martin appreciated and had asked for. The 3 Kansas Pacific executives indicted in the federal case had been convicted in the spring of 1875, and the fraudulent land grants had been formally vacated and the acres returned to the appropriate claimants. Martin Cooper had changed the land situation for several hundred families in western Kansas, and he had done it by doing the right thing when the right thing was expensive, and most of those families would never know his name. Della knew it. She said it to him one evening in the spring of 1877, when they were sitting outside in the warm air watching William, who was 14 months old and ambulatory, and deeply committed to the project of exploring every inch of the homestead, investigate a beetle with an absorption that made both his parents smile. "Those families got their land back because of you," she said. Martin watched his son crouch in the grass. "We never found out if any of them know," he said. "It does not matter," she said. "It happened. The world is different because you did a hard thing." He looked at her. "You did a hard thing too," he said. "You carried those documents into Hallett's office on nothing but a 2-hour conversation and a repaired axle and the conviction that I was telling the truth." "You were telling the truth," she said simply. "How did you know?" he said. He had asked this before in different forms in different moments, and she always gave the same answer because it was always true. "Your eyes," she said. "There is no deception in them. There never was." He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked back at William, who had by now acquired the beetle and was examining it with an intensity that suggested he was considering bringing it to show his parents. "I think he found a friend," Martin said. "He finds friends everywhere," Della said fondly. "He has your quality of, what did you call it, making people feel that they are being really seen." "I did not know that was something I did," Martin said, surprised. "You do," she said. "You see people. You saw me out on that road. You saw that I needed to be helped as a person, not protected as a woman or avoided as a complication. That is not common." He was quiet for a moment. "You saw me too," he said. "You saw a wanted man with an honest face, and you decided the honest face was the more important truth." He looked at her. "That changed my life." "That changed both our lives," she corrected. William arrived with the beetle, which he presented to his father with an expression of considerable pride. Martin accepted it with the seriousness the gesture deserved, examined it thoroughly, made several observations about it that were ostensibly addressed to William but were perfectly pitched to make Della laugh, and then released it back into the grass with a formal ceremony that reduced William to gleeful incomprehension. The beetle made its escape into the prairie, and William watched it go, and then turned to his parents with a look of great philosophical satisfaction at the completeness of the experience. In the fall of 1877, Martin's younger brother George came from Wisconsin to visit. He was 22 and had a rangy, cheerful energy that reminded Della of a young dog who had not yet grown fully into his feet. And he was immediately and utterly won over by everything: the land, the homestead, the school, William, the whole enterprise of the life his brother had built in Kansas. He stayed for 2 weeks and then wrote from Green Bay saying he intended to come back in the spring and file a homestead claim of his own. He did come back in the spring of 1878, with his older brother Henry in tow, who was quieter and more deliberate than George and who had left the family farm in George's keeping and intended to make his own start in the territories. Both brothers filed claims on adjoining land 2 miles west of Della and Martin's homestead, and the Cooper family became, that spring, a presence in Dickinson County that was felt in the land office, and the schoolhouse and the small general store that had appeared on the crossroads near the Svensson claim, and that was beginning to look like the seed of an actual town. Ada Clark, who had been teaching in the schoolhouse for 2 years, married a homesteader named Clark who was no relation to her but had, she told Della, a name she found comforting in its familiarity. The wedding was in May of 1878 and the whole community came, and it was the first genuine community gathering the area had seen. 23 adults and a collection of children who ran the perimeter of the event with the purposeful speed of children who had been inside too long and were making the most of an outdoor occasion. Della was expecting their second child by that summer, and she told Martin on a July evening sitting outside in the long prairie dusk, and his reaction was, if anything, even more purely joyful than the first time, uncomplicated by the newness of the experience. "Another one," he said, with a satisfaction in his voice that was entirely unconscious. "Another one," she agreed. Their daughter came into the world in January of 1879, on a morning that was considerably calmer than William's arrival, and produced a small, dark-haired, apparently perfectly composed person who regarded the world from her first moments with the same careful attention her father brought to everything. They named her Clara May Cooper, and from the first week of her life, it was entirely clear that she had inherited both her father's observational precision and her mother's complete comfort with expressing an opinion, which combination Martin declared was going to be either magnificent or exhausting, and Della said it was going to be both. William, who was 3, approached his new sister with the same focused scientific interest he brought to beetles and creek water, examined her with great thoroughness, and declared her acceptable. Clara May looked back at him with her dark, serious eyes and sneezed, which William found conclusively fascinating. The years moved through the homestead, the way years move through the prairie, not smoothly or uniformly, but in seasons, each one distinct and formative and accumulating into a whole that was more than its parts. The school grew and the community grew, and the crossroads that had been the site of a small general store became, by 1880, the beginnings of an actual township that was filing for incorporation under the name Cooperville, which Della found both touching and slightly mortifying. "They named it after you," she said. "After the survey work," Martin said. Hallett told the county commissioners about the Kansas Pacific case. "It is a civic compliment." "You are blushing," she said. "I am not," he said, clearly blushing. The town grew because the land was good and the water was reliable, and the survey work had been done correctly, which meant the claims were clean and the boundaries were clear, and the particular slow violence of disputed land that had torn apart other communities was not present here. Martin had given them that, the clean foundation on which a community could build without constantly fighting over its own edges. He had also, in the years since 1874, built something else that neither of them had named directly, but that both of them understood. He had become known in Dickinson County as a man whose word was worth something, whose survey work was accurate and whose judgment was sound. And when disputes arose between neighboring claimants about water rights or fence lines, people came to Martin Cooper not because he was an official authority, but because he was the kind of man whose opinion settled things. He had the gift of seeing a situation clearly and describing it honestly, which was, Della had thought more than once, essentially the same gift that had made him recognize a fraudulent land grant for what it was and refuse to let it stand. In the spring of 1881, a letter came from Senator Ingalls' office. The senator was coming to Abilene on a political tour of the territory and wished to meet Martin Cooper privately. Della read the letter with Martin at the kitchen table, William pressing close to see, Clara May on Della's lap as she always preferred to be when anything interesting was happening. "Are you going?" Della said. "Yes," Martin said. He paused. "He wants to discuss the possibility of formal appointment to the Federal Land Commission, a permanent position." She looked at him carefully. "What would that mean?" "It would mean we stay in Kansas," he said. "It would mean the work is formal and paid, and comes with authority to actually enforce the land laws rather than just report on them." He was quiet for a moment. "It would mean everything I tried to do 4 years ago as an act of desperation done properly, with the legal standing to make it stick." "What does it mean for the survey practice?" she said. "I would have to close it," he said. "Or hand it to George. He has done survey work with me for 3 years now. He could take it over." She was quiet for a moment, thinking through it. William was watching his father with the focused attention of a 5-year-old who did not entirely understand what was being discussed but understood that it mattered. "This is what you wanted," she said. "Not just the survey work, the larger thing, the ability to actually protect the process." "Yes," he said. "Then do it," she said simply. He looked at her across the table with all of that honest warmth that had been the first thing she had trusted in him, that she had staked her safety and her future on in a diner in Abilene in 1874 with a coffee cup between them and a wanted poster folded against her chest. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is well established." "Are you going to write Senator Ingalls back, or do you need me to do it?" He laughed. William laughed because his father laughed, and Clara May, not to be left out, produced a noise of considerable satisfaction at the general mood. Martin met with Senator Ingalls in Abilene in June of 1881, and the formal appointment to the Federal Land Commission for the Topeka District followed in September of that year. He was 34 years old when he took the appointment, and he brought to it 4 years of survey work, and 7 years of knowing the landscape of the land fraud that had shaped the period, and a comprehensive understanding of both the law and its practical failures. He also brought to it a reputation that preceded him across 3 counties, the reputation of a man who had been a wanted fugitive, and had turned himself into a protector of the very system he had once been condemned by, which was either an irony or a completing of a circle, depending on how you chose to look at it. Della chose to look at it as the completing of a circle. The work took him to Topeka for weeks at a time, which was the hardest part of the new arrangement, the absence that had not been part of their life before. He came home to the homestead every 3rd week, and she met him in the yard every time with the same directness she had brought to every moment of their life together. And William attached himself to his father's side for the entire duration of every visit. And Clara May, who was by now 2 and formidably verbal, offered detailed reports on everything that had occurred in his absence. In the fall of 1882, Della made the ride into what was now properly the town of Cooperville, and spoke to the county school board about a proper position as superintendent of schools for the district, which had grown to 3 schoolhouses serving 46 children. The board gave her the position unanimously, which she accepted with the practical satisfaction of someone whose instinct for the work had been confirmed. She was 28 months into the superintendent position when their 3rd child arrived in the winter of 1883, another boy, born in December on a night of heavy snow. They named him James Thomas Cooper, James for Della's father and Thomas for Martin's grandfather, and he arrived with the placid good nature of a child who had decided the world was probably fine and intended to enjoy it, which proved an accurate forecast of his personality. William at 7 was utterly charmed by the new baby. Clara May at 4 observed him with the seriousness of an expert assessor, and delivered, after 2 days, the verdict that he would do. Martin held his third child in the lamplight of the cabin, which was not a cabin anymore but a proper house with 4 rooms and a summer kitchen. And Della lay in the warm bed and watched him and thought about October of 1874, about a road and a broken axle and 2 hours of a man's careful hands. She thought about a wanted poster folded against her chest and the decision she had made to walk away from the sheriff's office without going in. She thought about standing in an alley asking a fugitive to have coffee with her, which, considered in retrospect, was one of the more consequential things she had ever done, and had been driven entirely by something she could not have articulated at the time, and could describe now only as the absolute certainty that the person in front of her was worth knowing. Martin looked up from the baby and found her watching him. "What?" he said softly, the same word he had said on the bank of the creek in 1874, in the same soft tone. "I was thinking about the road," she said, "about you riding out of the grass to fix my axle." "And then slipping away before you could thank me properly," he said, smiling. "You were trying to disappear again," she said. "If I had not seen that poster and gone outside, and if you had not been watching, and if I had not stopped on the porch steps," she paused, "there are so many moments where it could have gone differently." "But it did not," he said. "No," she said, "it did not." He came and sat on the edge of the bed with the sleeping baby in his arms, and she put her hand on his arm, and outside the December snow was falling on Dickinson County, Kansas, on the town of Cooperville and the schoolhouses, and the 40 acres that had a house on them now and a garden and a family, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and black against the white ground, and the sky was full of snow coming down in the dark like a benediction. "I am going to tell James about the axle someday," Martin said, "when he is old enough." "What will you tell him?" Della said. "That his mother drove herself into the frontier alone with 40 acres and a tin of peaches and the complete conviction that bravery was sufficient armor against disaster," Martin said, "and that she was, essentially, right." "Essentially," she said. "She did need 1 axle repair," he said mildly. She laughed, quietly so as not to wake the baby. "And what will you tell him about his father?" Martin thought about it for a moment. Outside, the snow fell on the Kansas prairie, and the fire in the next room spoke quietly to itself, and the house was warm. "I will tell him that his father was a man who did one difficult, honest thing," he said, "and that it cost him everything he had and gave him everything he needed, and that he was grateful for it every day of his life after." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said the only thing there was to say, which was also the simplest thing. "That is exactly right," she said. Martin Cooper looked at his wife in the lamplight of the house they had built together on 40 acres of Kansas prairie that she had driven herself to alone on a cold October morning in 1874, with a tin of preserved peaches and a broken axle, and a future she refused to let be taken from her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the first moment she had held her ground on a dusty road, and refused to be either alarmed or diminished, with complete attention and absolute recognition, the look of someone who knew exactly what they had and intended to honor it. The baby slept between them in the winter lamplight, and William and Clara May were asleep in the next room, and the snow fell on the Kansas prairie in the dark, and outside the window the world was white and still and full of the particular silence of things that were exactly as they should be. This was the life that had come from 2 hours on a road and a man who had fixed a stranger's wagon and ridden away without asking for anything, and a woman who had refused to let him disappear without being found, and a want poster folded against a chest, and a cup of coffee in a warm diner, and an envelope of documents delivered by a woman with chalk dust on her hands and 40 acres of conviction, and a kiss by a creek in the October light, and a marriage in December with a young preacher who did his earnest best, and a school with 9 children who spoke 4 languages, and a son who brought his father beetles, and a daughter who reported everything, and a second son who had decided the world was fine and intended to enjoy it, and a life that had been built out of courage and work and the specific gift of seeing another person clearly and choosing to trust what you saw. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The snow fell all night over Cooperville, Kansas, and in the morning the world was white and new, and in a house along the eastern edge of a 40-acre homestead near the creek where the cottonwoods stood, Della Walker Cooper woke in the gray February dawn and heard her husband in the next room building the morning fire with the quiet competence he brought to every practical thing. And she lay still for a moment with the sleeping baby warm beside her and listened to the sound of it. The creak and settle of a life that was fully and finally and irreversibly her own. She got up. She put on her boots and her wool wrapper. She walked into the next room where the fire was catching, and Martin turned when he heard her, and his face in the early morning light was the same face it had always been, honest and careful and warm with everything he felt for her. She went to him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood together in the warmth of the new fire, while the Kansas winter morning pressed against the windows and the children slept, and the world outside lay quiet under its deep white covering. "Good morning," he said against her hair. "Good morning," she said. The fire built itself into brightness around them. The morning opened itself above the prairie, cold and clear and full of everything that was possible. And Della Walker Cooper, who had driven herself into the frontier alone with 40 acres and a tin of preserved peaches and an absolute refusal to be defeated, stood in the warmth of her husband's arms in the house they had built together and was home.